In the autumn of 1965, the Higgins family of four vanished without a trace from their small cottage in the quiet village of Ashworth, Yorkshire. Their disappearance might have remained just another unsolved mystery in the dusty files of the local constabulary, if not for what was discovered 3 months later. Hidden beneath St. Mary's Church, investigators uncovered a secret room containing the personal belongings of the Higgins family and a series of handwritten journal entries describing rituals that the Church of England had banned centuries before. The most unsettling detail? The final entry was dated 2 weeks after the family had already been reported missing. For nearly 60 years, the church has refused to comment on the discovery. The Higgins cottage still stands abandoned, untouched by time, as if waiting. But what makes this case even more disturbing is what came to light in 1985, when investigators finally gained access to sealed church records. They found that the Higgins family was not the first to vanish under such mysterious circumstances. Tonight, I'll reveal what really happened in that quiet Yorkshire village, based on documents that have never before been made public, including testimony from the only surviving witness, who has finally agreed to break 40 years of silence. Before we continue with the story of the Higgins family and their dark connection to St. Mary's Church, I have to warn you, this channel isn't for everyone. It's only for the bravest souls who dare to uncover the darkest mysteries others are too afraid to tell. If you're one of those true seekers of the unknown, subscribe now and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Few channels dare to share the stories we tell here, stories that authorities try to bury forever. Now, let's step back into the shadows of 1965 Yorkshire and uncover the terror that awaited in Ashworth village. What unfolded in that small community would shake everything its residents believed about their peaceful, God-fearing lives, revealing a conspiracy of silence that had protected unspeakable secrets for nearly half a century. Ashworth was the kind of place where time seemed to move differently. The ancient stone walls held the weight of 8 centuries of memory. Nestled deep in the Yorkshire dales, surrounded by rolling hills that turned purple with heather each autumn, it was home to barely 300 souls, most of whom could trace their family lines back 5 or 6 generations, living in the same weathered cottages. At its heart stood St. Mary's Church, a magnificent Norman structure that towered above the landscape, its limestone walls worn smooth by centuries of wind and rain. The church had been built in 1187 on the site of an even older Saxon chapel. Local folklore claimed the ground itself had been sacred long before Christianity ever came to the Dales. The massive oak doors, reinforced with blackened iron bands, creaked in the wind that forever swept down from the moors. The autumn of 1965 brought with it an unusual chill, one that seemed to seep into the very bones of the village. The leaves turned earlier than anyone could remember, painting the hillsides in crimson and gold so vivid they almost looked unnatural. Each evening, a thick fog began to roll in from the valley, clinging to the stones of St. Mary's like something alive. It was so dense that villagers claimed to lose their bearings while crossing the churchyard at dusk, as if the familiar paths had shifted within the mist. Even the church bells began to sound different that autumn. Mrs. Agnes Peaton, who had lived beside the church for 63 years, noticed it first. The bells seemed deeper, heavier, as though the very air had grown thick around them. Sometimes, late at night, she swore she heard them ringing when they shouldn't be, soft, mournful peals that seemed to rise not from the tower above, but from deep underground. Thomas Arthur Higgins was a man of strict routine. At 38, he had inherited both his post at the village post office and his methodical nature from his father, and his father before him. Every morning at precisely 7 o'clock, Thomas would step from his cottage on Church Lane, dressed neatly in his pressed suit, carrying his worn leather satchel. He would walk his 2 children, 12-year-old Margaret Rose and 8-year-old William Thomas, to the village school before heading to his work, sorting mail and managing telegrams for the entire valley. Quiet and reserved, Thomas was known as a deeply religious man, devout but modest, faithful yet practical. He served as a church warden at St. Mary's, ensuring each Sunday that the hymnals were neatly arranged and collection plates polished. His faith was steady and unshakable, like the Yorkshire hills themselves, which made what happened next all the more incomprehensible. Ellen Mary Higgins, née Whitlock, had come to Ashworth as a young bride 15 years earlier. At 35, she still possessed quiet beauty that had caught Thomas's eye at a church social years before. Her dark hair, worn in a simple, practical style, still caught the light in a way that made her seem younger than her years. Ellen managed their small cottage with the same precision that defined her husband. But unlike Thomas, she had a restless curiosity, a fascination with the past that often put her at odds with the village's old-fashioned ways. She spent hours in the small library, reading about ancient customs and forgotten folklore of the Yorkshire dales. Her garden overflowed with herbs and wildflowers, plants the older villagers recognized from their grandmother's stories, used for purposes long unspoken in polite company. When asked about her unusual botanical interests, Ellen would simply smile and say she liked keeping old traditions alive, though she never quite said which tradition she meant. The Higgins children were the pride of the village school. Margaret Rose was a serious, thoughtful girl who excelled in her studies and helped her mother with household chores without a single complaint. She had inherited her mother's dark hair and her father's calm, steady nature, yet her teachers often remarked that she seemed older than her 12 years, as though she carried a knowledge too heavy for someone so young. Margaret loved to read, especially books about history and mythology. She could often be found in the churchyard, carefully copying inscriptions from the oldest headstones into a small notebook she carried everywhere. Her younger brother, William Thomas, known to everyone as Billy, was the village's little charmer. At just 8 years old, he had an infectious laugh and an endless curiosity that made him a favorite among the villagers. He was fascinated by the church, spending hours studying the carved stone gargoyles that lined its walls and asking endless questions about the meanings behind the stained glass windows. Billy had a habit of drawing constantly, filling notebook after notebook with sketches of the church, the moors, and the people around him. But as autumn deepened, his drawings began to change. They became darker, stranger, images that his teacher found increasingly difficult to understand. The village of Ashworth moved to rhythms that hadn't changed in centuries. Market day was still held every Thursday in the small square beside the church, though now the merchants arrived by motor car instead of horse and cart. The pub, the Shepherd's Rest, acted as the unofficial town hall, where gossip spread faster than the ale was poured. The post office doubled as a general store, and a little schoolhouse taught children from 5 to 14 before sending them off to the nearby town of Horsley for their final education. Yet beneath this picture of rural peace, Ashworth had secrets, ancient ones that passed quietly from one generation to the next. The village had always been isolated, not just by geography, but by blood and belief. The old families, the Whitlocks, the Carrs, the Thorntons, and a handful of others, preserved traditions outsiders never fully saw. These families intermarried, protecting old knowledge that was whispered through carefully chosen bloodlines. One of them, Mrs. Margaret Thornton, the village librarian and unofficial keeper of local lore, came from one of Ashworth's founding families. Her cottage overflowed with books and manuscripts collected over centuries, including texts the church had once tried to suppress during times of religious reform. Mrs. Thornton herself was a tiny, bird-like woman in her 70s, who spoke in hushed tones and somehow knew everyone's business before they did. She had never married, devoting her life instead to what she called preserving our heritage. Dr. Edmund Carr, the village physician, was another descendant of the old families. At 55, he had returned to Ashworth after studying medicine in Edinburgh, blending his modern medical knowledge with the older remedies his grandmother had taught him. He kept meticulous notes not only on his patients' physical health, but also on what he called their spiritual well-being, though no one ever fully understood what he meant by that. The local constable, Sergeant Robert Henley, was one of few authority figures not tied to the old bloodlines. He had been assigned to Ashworth 5 years earlier and had gradually realized there were parts of village life forever closed to him. A thorough, methodical man, Henley prided himself on knowing every inch of his territory, and his inability to understand Ashworth's hidden customs had become a growing source of frustration. Reverend Harold Whitmore had served at St. Mary's for 23 years. He'd arrived in Ashworth as a young, eager curate, full of zeal for church reform. But over the decades, he had changed, becoming something far more complex and far more unsettling. His study in the rectory was lined with ancient manuscripts, archaeological relics, and obscure texts that seemed to have little to do with Anglican theology. Reverend Whitmore was a tall, thin man with prematurely gray hair and eyes that seemed to look through people rather than at them. His sermons had grown increasingly cryptic, filled with references to older truths and deeper mysteries that left many parishioners confused and uneasy. Yet he remained admired by certain members of the congregation, particularly those from the old families, who seemed to understand meanings that escaped everyone else. In the weeks leading up to their disappearance, several villagers noticed strange changes in the Higgins family. At first, the differences were subtle. Ellen spending more time in the churchyard, Thomas appearing distracted and anxious, the children quieter than usual. But as October wore on, those changes became impossible to ignore. Mrs. Agnes Peaton, whose cottage shared a garden wall with the Higgins property, was the first to notice Ellen's nighttime habits. Starting in early October, Ellen began spending long hours in St. Mary's churchyard after dark, often carrying bundles of herbs, flowers, and other objects that Agnes couldn't quite make out in the moonlight. One evening, working up her courage, Mrs. Peaton asked what she was doing. Ellen had smiled and replied softly, "I'm tending to the old traditions, Mrs. Peaton. Someone has to keep the proper observances." The phrase proper observances meant nothing to her, but it left Agnes with an unease she couldn't shake. Ellen's voice had been pleasant enough, but her eyes, they held a depth of knowledge that chilled the older woman to the bone. After that night, Mrs. Peaton began keeping her curtains drawn after dusk and found excuses to avoid her neighbor. Arthur Finch, owner of the village general store, also began noticing odd changes. Ellen, usually a careful and modest shopper, suddenly started purchasing strange items: pounds of coarse salt, dozens of white candles, and bundles of rare herbs from old Mrs. Weatherby, the local herbalist known for a garden of medicinal and some whispered magical plants. When Mr. Finch asked about these unusual supplies, Ellen explained she was preparing for the harvest season, though that made little sense, as the Higgins family only kept a small kitchen garden. The items seemed far more ceremonial than domestic, but being a polite man, Finch asked no further questions. Meanwhile, Miss Sarah Collins, the village schoolteacher, grew increasingly troubled by the behavior of the Higgins. During October, the Higgins children began to change in ways that unsettled everyone who knew them. Margaret, once an excellent student, became distracted and withdrawn. She would often stare out the classroom window towards St. Mary's Church, her expression distant and dreamlike. When called upon, she would answer questions as though waking from a trance. Her essays, once neat and well-structured, grew strange, filled with cryptic references to ancient wisdom and forgotten truths that seemed far too advanced for a 12-year-old girl. But it was young Billy's behavior that alarmed his teacher most. The cheerful, talkative boy had become obsessed with drawing, spending every free moment sketching the same haunting image again and again. Each drawing depicted robed figures standing around what looked like an altar, marked with symbols that Miss Collins didn't recognize. Symbols that made her uneasy for reasons she couldn't explain. When she gently asked Billy about his drawings, he smiled and said, "It's what Mommy and Mr. Whitmore taught me about the old church." Disturbed, Miss Collins arranged a parent conference with Thomas Higgins in mid-October. But Thomas, normally composed and polite, seemed tense and evasive. He admitted that Ellen had become involved in what he called historical research with Reverend Whitmore and several other villagers. He insisted it was only academic, nothing more than a study group exploring local history. Yet his tone betrayed unease, as though he no longer believed his own words. The organization at the center of Ashworth's dark mystery had begun, outwardly, as something innocent. In 1962, Reverend Harold Whitmore had proposed forming a small group to study the ancient traditions of the Yorkshire Dales, with particular attention to the pre-Christian customs that had shaped local culture long before the arrival of the church. The group began with just 5 members: Reverend Whitmore himself, Mrs. Margaret Thorne, the librarian, Dr. Edmund Carr, the village physician, Mrs. Dorothy Weatherby, the herbalist, and Mr. James Crawford, a retired schoolmaster who had recently moved to Ashworth from London. They met once a month in the church vestry, discussing archaeological finds, ancient manuscripts, and local folklore. They called themselves the Ashworth Historical Preservation Society, claiming their goal was to compile a comprehensive study of Yorkshire folklore for future generations. In the spring of 1964, Ellen Higgins joined their ranks. Encouraged by Reverend Whitmore, who had admired her growing interest in folklore and old traditions, she quickly became one of the group's most dedicated members, contributing detailed research on herbal medicine and seasonal customs that impressed even the most learned participants. But behind closed doors, the society's purpose had already begun to shift. By 1963, the group had started conducting what they described as practical demonstrations of ancient rituals, claiming that reenacting them was necessary to truly understand their historical meaning. At first, these activities seemed harmless enough. Seasonal celebrations marking harvests and solstices, herbal preparations using old recipes, and meditation practices said to be drawn from Celtic spiritual traditions. Yet, under Reverend Whitmore's guidance, the tone gradually changed. The rituals became more complex and increasingly unsettling. The vicar preached that true understanding required not only study, but participation. The early church, he claimed, had suppressed valuable spiritual knowledge, and it was their duty to restore it. By the time Ellen joined, the group was meeting twice a month, with special observances held on what Whitmore referred to as significant dates on the ancient calendar. These ceremonies took place in a room beneath St. Mary's Church, a chamber the Reverend claimed to have discovered during renovation work. According to him, it had once served as a sacred site long before the church above was built, a direct link, he said, to the spiritual roots of their ancestors. Ellen's enthusiasm for the society's work impressed everyone, but it was her suggestion that families should take part together in certain rituals that marked the turning point. She argued that many ancient ceremonies were designed around family unity, and that incomplete participation might be dangerous, leaving the rituals unfinished in ways that could bring about negative consequences. Thomas Higgins had been skeptical of his wife's new passion, but her excitement and renewed sense of purpose eventually won him over. She returned from meetings brimming with stories about Yorkshire's hidden past, tales so strange and vivid that even Thomas, ever a practical man, found himself drawn in. When Ellen invited him to attend one of the society's lectures, he reluctantly agreed. The meeting he attended in June of 1964 seemed completely harmless. Reverend Whitmore gave an engaging talk about medieval farming methods, displaying old tools and parchment records borrowed from local collections. The group appeared well-educated and genuinely interested in historical preservation. Thomas even found the discussion fascinating, thinking how it must have felt for his ancestors to live off the harsh Yorkshire soil centuries ago. But as the months passed and Ellen became more deeply entangled in the group's activities, Thomas began noticing troubling changes. She spoke more critically of modern religion, claiming that contemporary Christianity had lost the true spiritual wisdom of the ancients. She started keeping strange hours, reading obscure manuscripts late into the night, and rising before dawn to tend to mysterious mixtures and plants with no clear purpose. Most disturbing of all, she began insisting that their children should learn the old ways. Ellen started teaching Margaret and Billy about herbal remedies, seasonal rituals, and what she called proper respect for the forces that shape our world. At first, the children seemed to enjoy these lessons, treating them as a game, a kind of family secret. But soon, Thomas noticed they had become secretive, whispering to one another, sharing private symbols and inside jokes that he couldn't understand. In September of 1965, Thomas finally decided to confront Reverend Whitmore directly about his growing concerns. He arranged a private meeting in the vicar's study, intending to discuss Ella and Nina's deepening obsession with the historical group and the toll it was beginning to take on their family life. What he discovered during that conversation would haunt him for the rest of his short life. Reverend Whitmore received Thomas his study, a room that had always seemed cluttered with books and papers, but now felt suffocatingly dense with strange artifacts and unfamiliar, ancient-looking texts. The vicar listened patiently as Thomas spoke, nodding sympathetically, asking measured questions about specific changes in Ella and Nina's behavior. But when Thomas finally finished, the Reverend's response was nothing like what he had expected. Instead of offering reassurance or suggesting moderation, Whitmore began explaining why the family's participation in the society's work was not merely beneficial, but essential. He spoke of spiritual obligations that transcended personal will, of ancient responsibilities that certain families had been chosen to uphold, and of the dangerous consequences that came with abandoning traditions which, he claimed, had protected the community for generations. Thomas left that meeting shaken, more confused, and more frightened than before. Whitmore's words carried an unspoken threat, something Thomas couldn't quite identify, but could undeniably feel. The Reverend had made it clear the Higgins family's involvement in the group was not simply encouraged, it was required. What would happen if they refused? He did not say. As October 1965 arrived, strange events in Ashworth seemed to intensify, all centering on the Higgins household. Ella and Nina's activities grew increasingly secretive. Multiple visits to St. Mary's each week, and endless preparations of strange materials whose purpose she refused to explain to her increasingly worried husband. The children, too, began acting strangely. Margaret and Billy both displayed knowledge and vocabulary far beyond their years, unsettling even to their teachers. Dr. Edmund Carr would later testify that Thomas visited his office 3 times that month, suffering from extreme anxiety and what the doctor described as acute nervous exhaustion. Thomas spoke of insomnia, loss of appetite, and, most chillingly, a constant feeling of impending doom. When Dr. Carr pressed him for details, Thomas could only say that his wife had become involved in activities he feared were dangerous for them all. During his final visit on October 25th, Thomas seemed on the brink of collapse. He spoke rapidly and incoherently about ancient obligations and ceremonies that cannot be stopped once they begin. He asked Dr. Carr about the symptoms of what he called religious mania and whether there were treatments for those convinced they were receiving messages from beyond the natural world. Most disturbingly, Thomas asked whether the doctor believed old evils could linger, whether something wicked might persist in places scarred by terrible acts. When Dr. Carr asked what prompted such a question, Thomas whispered that Ella and Nina had been spending time in parts of the church that had never been open to the public, and that she claimed to be receiving guidance from sources beyond this world. Dr. Carr urged Thomas to speak with Reverend Whitmore about his spiritual fears, advice the doctor would regret for the rest of his life. What he didn't know was that Whitmore was not the family's savior, but the very architect of their downfall. In that final week of October, the Higgins household changed dramatically. Everyone in Ashworth noticed. Ella and Nina stopped attending her usual gatherings and was rarely seen outside, except for her constant visits to the church. The children no longer played with friends. They grew pale, withdrawn, almost lifeless. Thomas missed several days of work, something unheard of in his 15 years at the post office. Their neighbor, Mrs. Petton, later testified to hearing strange sounds coming from the Higgins cottage, rhythmic chanting, the crackle of fires burning some bitter-smelling substance, and voices speaking too low to understand, but filled with an intensity that made her blood run cold. On more than one occasion, she saw figures in dark clothing arrive after nightfall, silent visitors who never stayed long, but whose presence lingered like a shadow. October 31st, 1965, a Sunday, it dawned gray and cold, with fog hanging low over Ashworth, so thick it hid the top of St. Mary's Tower completely. That morning's church service seemed ordinary at first. The Higgins family sat in their usual pew, 3rd row near the aisle, yet several parishioners later described their behavior as deeply unsettling. Evelina sat perfectly still, her expression locked in grim concentration throughout Whitmore's sermon, which, unusually, focused on ancient covenants and their endurance through time. She took notes in a small leather journal, something she had never done before. Beside her, Thomas sat rigid, pale, hands clenched tightly in his lap. The children were silent, unnaturally so. Whitmore's sermon itself was unlike his typical messages. He spoke of duties that transcend free will, of the wisdom of the old ways, and of completing what has been begun. His cryptic references to tonight's observance meant nothing to most of the congregation, but clearly carried deep meaning for a chosen few. After the service, the Higgins family was seen walking home together, but something about their movement seemed off. They walked quickly, purposefully, almost as if driven by some unseen urgency. Mrs. Petton, tending her garden as they passed, called out a friendly greeting. None of them responded, not even the children. It was the last time anyone saw the entire Higgins family alive, around 2:30 that afternoon. In the late afternoon, Mr. Finch saw the Higgins family enter their cottage and firmly close the door behind them. What happened afterward would only be reconstructed months later from fragments of evidence discovered beneath St. Mary's Church. That evening, Mrs. Petton noticed something strange. The lights in the Higgins cottage went out much earlier than usual. By 8 o'clock, the house was completely dark. This had never happened before, especially on a Sunday, when the family always spent the evening reading and preparing for the coming week. At 10 o'clock, she glanced through her curtains again. The house remained silent and lifeless. Then, sometime after midnight, on October 31st, Mrs. Petton witnessed the event that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She woke up to sounds she first mistook for a dream, distant chanting that rose and fell in a slow, rhythmic pattern, hypnotic yet deeply unsettling. Realizing the noises were real, she crept to her bedroom window. What she saw in St. Mary's churchyard defied all sense of reason. Dark figures, each carrying a candle or torch, move in a solemn procession around the old church. Their faces were hidden beneath heavy robes, their movements slow and deliberate, as though part of a carefully rehearsed ritual. The chanting continued endlessly, rising, falling, but never stopping. Mrs. Petton could swear she heard children's voices among the adults. High, clear tones that sliced through the deeper ones, making her stomach twist with unease. Then came the moment that truly broke her. The figures began to move toward the church itself and vanished. They didn't enter through the doors. They simply disappeared, as though the ancient stone had swallowed them whole. Flickering lights continued to dance in the churchyard for hours afterward, but she never saw anyone emerge again. By Monday morning, November 1st, 1965, the mystery had begun, a case that would soon become one of the strangest missing persons investigations in Yorkshire's history. When Thomas Higgins didn't show up at the post office by 8:15 a.m., his supervisor, Mr. Gregory Walsh, assumed it was a family emergency. But after several unanswered calls to the cottage, he decided to walk there himself. He knocked, got no response, and peered through the windows. Everything inside was neat and undisturbed, yet it felt empty in a way that suggested the absence wasn't temporary. Sergeant Robert Henley arrived within half an hour to begin his investigation. What he found only deepened the mystery. The cottage door was unlocked, unusual, but not unheard of in such a trusting village. Inside, everything was spotless. No struggle, no signs of a rushed departure, nothing missing that should have explained the disappearance. Eleanor's purse hung neatly on its hook. Thomas's wallet sat untouched in the dresser. The children's school clothes were laid out for Monday morning. In the kitchen, the remains of Sunday dinner had been cleaned up completely, dishes washed and stored. Yet a few details stood out. The candles Mrs. Petton had seen glow in the night before were gone. Several books from Eleanor's folklore collection were missing, along with some of her herbal preparations. In Thomas's small study, Henley found an open Bible on the desk. Turned to the book of Revelation, chapter 20, which speaks of the binding of Satan and the judgment of the dead. In the margin, written in Eleanor's hand, were the words, "The old covenant must be honored at all costs." Below it, in Thomas's sharp handwriting, "God help us all. I fear we have gone too far to turn back." Henley spent the entire day questioning every resident of Ashworth who might know something. Everyone agreed the family had been acting strangely lately, but no one could explain why, or where they might have gone. When he spoke to Reverend Whitmore about the Historical Preservation Society, the vicar admitted that Eleanor had been an active member, but insisted the group's activities were purely academic. When pressed for details, however, he became defensive, claiming the meetings were confidential and accusing Henley of overstepping. Dr. Carr was even less helpful. He cited patient confidentiality, though he finally admitted that Thomas had been under severe anxiety related to family pressures. He refused to elaborate. Mrs. Thornton, the local librarian, offered the only real lead, though it was hardly reassuring. She explained that the society had recently been researching ancient religious rituals and that some members had grown too enthusiastic about reenacting them. Their recent meetings, she said, had focused on seasonal observances, ceremonies once practiced in the region centuries ago. Then, 3 days later, came the breakthrough from an entirely unexpected source. Miss Sarah Collins, the village schoolteacher, approached Sergeant Henley with something she said he needed to hear. Miss Collins arrived at the station carrying a folder that would change everything. Inside was a collection of Billy Higgins's drawings, made throughout October. The sketches showed robed figures gathered around what appeared to be an underground altar, surrounded by strange symbols and geometric patterns. Far too intricate for an 8-year-old child to invent. She also handed over several essays written by Margaret in the weeks before the family vanished. The topics were unsettling, the wisdom of ancient traditions, and why modern people have forgotten sacred truths. The writing was flawless, too flawless, filled with language and ideas that clearly came from adult influence, not a 12-year-old mind. With this evidence, Sergeant Henley could no longer dismiss the possibility that the Historical Preservation Society had crossed far beyond the boundaries of academic curiosity. He decided to conduct a more thorough search of St. Mary's Church, one that would take him deeper than ever before. It was during this search that he noticed something he'd overlooked earlier. The church's interior layout didn't quite match its exterior. Certain walls were thicker than they should have been, and the building's footprint hinted at rooms that shouldn't exist. Measuring carefully, Henley realized there were hidden spaces within the old stone structure. Behind the altar, he found what confirmed his suspicions, a section of masonry that didn't belong. The stones were fitted too neatly. There were patterns subtly different. When he pried them loose, they revealed a narrow passage descending steeply into darkness beneath the church. The tunnel was carved straight into the bedrock, its air cold and stale. At the bottom, Henley found himself in a circular chamber roughly 30 feet across. The walls were covered in carvings, a chaotic blend of Christian symbols intertwined with older, unmistakably pagan markings. The floor was made from ancient stone slabs arranged in a pattern that drew the eye toward a single focal point, a massive altar of black stone. The altar was older than the church itself, possibly older than the village. Its surface was stained with dark residues Henley preferred not to analyze. Around it lay half-burned candles, dried herbs, and crude ritual tools, as if the chamber had been used only recently. The air reeked of incense mixed with something metallic and sharp that turned his stomach. Then came the discovery that froze him where he stood. On the altar rested a small collection of personal items: Eleanor's wedding ring, Thomas's pocket watch, Margaret's school ribbon, and Billy's toy soldier. Each item was carefully placed, not discarded. It looked like an offering. Scattered around the chamber were notebooks and loose papers. Some were decades old, handwritten journals detailing ceremonies and rituals that had been carried out beneath the church by generations of Ashworth residents. The most recent entries, unmistakably in Eleanor Higgins's handwriting, revealed the society's true purpose. Her journals trace her involvement from 1964 until her final entry on October 30th, 1965. At first, her writing brimmed with intellectual curiosity about folklore and ancient rites. But over time, her tone shifted. From academic fascination to devotion, she began referring to the old wisdom and the true faith. By the spring of 1965, Eleanor and society had moved beyond study into what she called practical restoration. They had come to believe that Christianity had diluted essential spiritual truths, and that by reviving older traditions, they could restore balance and protection to the community. She described their ceremonies in vivid, almost loving detail. The chants, the symbols, the sacred circles of renewal. But she glossed over what these rituals demanded. Her tone grew fevered, her faith unshakable. One entry described something called the harvest ceremony, a ritual meant to renew the bond between the living and the unseen. According to her notes, it could only be performed by a complete family and only during certain nights when the veil between worlds grows thin. In her final pages, Eleanor wrote with manic conviction. She believed her family had been chosen to preserve the ancient covenant. She described omens, lights, dreams, and voices calling to fulfill their duty. But it was what Henley found next that revealed the full horror. Hidden beneath loose stones near the altar was a second journal, much older than Eleanor's, its leather cover cracked and brittle. The handwriting inside belonged to several different people, with entries stretching back to the 1920s. The earliest pages bore the name of Reverend Michael Blackwood, Whitmore's predecessor at St. Mary's, who had served from 1919 until his mysterious death in 1942. His first entries described his accidental discovery of the underground chamber during church renovations, and his growing fascination with the ancient relics and carvings found within. Like Whitmore decades later, Blackwood had been a learned man, but what he recorded next would suggest that knowledge was never his only pursuit. According to Whitmore's writings, this conditioning reached its peak during the final weeks before the ceremony. Families were encouraged to withdraw from ordinary life, to reduce contact with neighbors, to stop attending social events, and to spend increasing time in private devotion under Whitmore's supervision. He described this isolation as spiritual purification. But in practice, it severed the family's last ties to the outside world. The rituals themselves were conducted in the underground chamber beneath St. Mary's. Whitmore's journal provided chillingly precise accounts of the ceremonies. The language was cloaked in religious terminology, offering covenant preservation renewal. Yet the meaning was unmistakable. The harvest always required blood, and always ended with the disappearance of an entire family. Henley's notes describe reading these passages late into the night, unable to stop even as nausea and disbelief set in. The names of the victims matched local disappearances that had long been attributed to immigration or tragic accidents. In each case, there had been no bodies, no funerals, only rumors and polite silences that, in hindsight, concealed something monstrous. Whitmore's later entries revealed that he considered his work not murder, but stewardship. He believed the rituals maintained what he called the veil, a spiritual barrier protecting Ashworth from unseen forces. The covenant must be renewed every 7 years, he wrote. If we fail, the old powers will rise again and all will be consumed. This belief appeared to have driven his every action. The 1959 harvest, the Higgins family, was described in excruciating detail. Whitmore noted their purity of spirit, their willing submission, and the calm acceptance of the children. His words suggested genuine conviction that the family's sacrifice would bring divine favor to the village. By the early 1960s, however, Whitmore's tone began to shift. His entries grew increasingly fragmented and paranoid. He wrote of signs of decay, omens of rebellion, and the new generation's weakening faith. He feared that younger members of the Historical Preservation Society were beginning to doubt the old ways, that the rituals might soon be questioned. It was around this time that Eleanor Higgins joined the society. Whitmore's early references to her were glowing. He called her a seeker of true knowledge, and a vessel fit to continue the covenant. As her involvement deepened, his tone changed from admiration to dependency. He wrote that Eleanor possessed a purity of devotion even I can no longer summon. Henley realized, with growing horror, that Whitmore had come to see Eleanor as a successor, the one who would lead the next generation of sacrifices. His final coherent entries, written in early October 1965, describe preparations for the renewal of the bloodline, a ritual that, according to him, would restore the fading power of the covenant and seal the protection for another era. The chosen participants were listed by name: Thomas, Eleanor, Margaret, and William Higgins. The journal ended abruptly. The last line, dated October 30th, 1965, reads simply, "The signs are clear. They have accepted. The circle will close at midnight. Ashworth shall endure." When Sergeant Henley finished reading, the chamber seemed to close in around him. The candlelight flickered against the carvings on the stone, symbols that no longer looked like decoration but signatures, records of every covenant renewed in blood. Henley sealed the journals in evidence bags and radioed for assistance, but before his call connected, the line cut out. Later reports noted that the church's old wiring had been unreliable, but Henley would swear, to his dying day, that what silenced the radio was not mechanical failure, but something else, a low vibration in the stone beneath his feet, a sound like distant chanting echoing from beyond the walls. He left the chamber without looking back. Eleanor Higgins's journal entries revealed how deeply this manipulation had taken hold. Her transformation from a curious researcher into a fervent believer unfolded over 18 months of deliberate psychological conditioning. Whitmore had skillfully exploited her intellectual curiosity, her spiritual longing, and her deep desire to feel chosen, significant, and set apart from others. By October 1965, Eleanor was no longer a passive follower. She had become one of the strongest advocates for her own family's participation in the so-called ceremony. The final pages of both her journal and Whitmore's hidden records gave a chillingly detailed account of the events leading up to the Higgins family's murder. The ritual had been meticulously planned for months. Every aspect was prepared, not just the symbolic elements, but the practical logistics of how to dispose of the bodies and how to explain the family's disappearance to the townspeople. Eleanor's last entry, dated October 30th, showed her complete psychological surrender to Whitmore's influence. She wrote with disturbing excitement about being chosen for spiritual elevation and expressed gratitude for the sacred honors service. Her only concern was Thomas, her husband, who still showed hesitation. Yet she noted that Reverend Whitmore had reassured her. Thomas's doubts would fade during the ceremony itself. Whitmore's own account of the night of October 31st was cold, methodical, and written with the detachment of a man describing routine maintenance rather than murder. The ceremony began at 11 p.m. in the underground chamber beneath St. Mary's, with the Higgins family and 6 members of the Historical Preservation Society present. Among them were Dr. Carr, Mrs. Thornton, Mrs. Weather, Mr. Crawford, and 2 others Henley would later identify as respected townspeople. The ritual was constructed to wear down any resistance, beginning with harmless-seeming practices: chanting, candlelight, herbal incense, all familiar from previous gatherings. But as the night went on, these were mixed with psychological manipulation and what Whitmore called spiritual substances, hallucinogenic drugs secretly dissolved in the wine. Thomas's eventual resistance had been expected. When he tried to flee with his children, the others restrained him by force. Disoriented and terrified, the children couldn't comprehend what was happening. Whitmore's description of their deaths was horrifyingly brief. He referred to them simply as the offering completed. The methods used, he claimed, were ancient sacrificial rites, though in reality, they were nothing more than efficient techniques of execution. The bodies were disposed in a labyrinth of natural caves beneath the church, tunnels that, according to the journals, had been used for the same purpose for decades. The cover-up that followed was just as carefully organized as the murder itself. Dr. Carr forged medical records claiming the family had contracted a contagious illness requiring immediate relocation. Mrs. Thornton spread gossip that Thomas had accepted a job offer in another county. Valuable possessions from the Higgins home were quietly redistributed among society members. Everything else was burned or buried. Within a week, the cottage had been scrubbed clean and rented to a new family, told that the previous tenants had emigrated to Canada. When Sergeant Henley began investigating, his progress was deliberately obstructed. Locals lied, withheld information, and dismissed his questions about the Historical Preservation Society as absurd. A network of silence, built from fear, loyalty, and guilt, protected the truth. Yet whispers persisted. A few villagers had quietly voiced suspicions about the strange disappearances, but most preferred to look away rather than challenge the illusion of peace that held Ashworth together. Just when Henley believed he understood the extent of the horror, new evidence surfaced, proof that the conspiracy ran far deeper than he had imagined. If this story has sent a chill down your spine, share it with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Tap that like button to support the channel, and don't forget to subscribe, because what comes next reveals the most disturbing truth of all. What happened when Henley finally confronted the living members of this decades-long conspiracy of silence? Armed with the journals and physical evidence from the chamber, Henley faced an impossible task: bringing justice to a community that had long protected its own monsters. His investigation exposed at least 12 people with direct knowledge of the killings, and dozens more who had helped conceal them. His first arrest was Dr. Edmund Carr. The evidence was irrefutable: his forged records, his handwriting in the ritual notes, his presence at the chamber. At first, Carr denied everything, insisting the journals were fiction written by lunatics. But confronted with undeniable proof in the testimonies of his peers, his composure shattered. His confession revealed the psychological mechanisms that had allowed the cult to survive for generations. Many participants, he said, had convinced themselves they weren't killing anyone. They were guiding souls to transcendence. This collective delusion had been crucial, insulating them from guilt, ensuring their silence, and turning murder into a ritual of supposed salvation. Mrs. Margaret Thornton, however, proved far more resistant. Been raised in a town built on secrecy, and murder left deep scars that lasted a lifetime. Under questioning, Mrs. Margaret Thornton initially maintained that the Historical Preservation Society had been nothing more than a respectable academic group devoted to research. For several days, she calmly denied any knowledge of wrongdoing. But when investigators searched her cottage and discovered personal possessions belonging to multiple murdered families, jewelry, letters, children's toys, her composure finally cracked. Her confession exposed just how thoroughly the killings had been woven into Ashworth's social and economic fabric. The victims' belongings were redistributed among the conspirators. Their cottages were sold or rented to fund the society's operations. In several cases, the disappearances were not random acts of ritual sacrifice at all, but deliberate efforts to remove families considered undesirable or disruptive to the community's image. Reverend Whitmore's arrest, however, was the most shocking of all. When Sergeant Henley arrived at the rectory with a warrant, he found the Reverend in his study, frantically trying to burn stacks of documents. It was clear he had been expecting them. In the days leading up to his arrest, he had worked feverishly to destroy any trace of evidence. By then, Whitmore's mental state had deteriorated badly. His later journal entries had already shown signs of paranoia and megalomania, and when Henley confronted him, the once composed clergyman had descended into complete delusion. He rambled about divine obligations, heavenly mandates, and the sacred balance, his words bearing no connection to reality. The trial of the Ashworth conspirators at York Crown Court in the spring of 1966 became one of the most sensational legal cases in British history. The proceedings exposed a horrifying depth of conspiracy, a web of ritual murder, property theft, and communal silence that spanned decades. The prosecution's case centered on the journals, the evidence from the underground chamber, and the testimony of townspeople who had finally broken their silence. One by one, witnesses admitted varying degrees of knowledge, from direct involvement to willful ignorance. Each testimony peeled back another layer of Ashworth's moral decay. Dr. Carr's detailed confession proved especially devastating. He described the psychological manipulation used by both Father Blackwood and Reverend Whitmore, showing how rational, educated individuals were systematically broken down and reshaped into obedient participants. It was a process of spiritual grooming, slow, deliberate, and devastatingly effective. Many of the accused had truly believed they were serving a higher cause, even as they committed acts of unimaginable cruelty. But the trial revealed something even darker: greed. Alongside its religious justification, the cult had a financial motive. Many of the victims had owned land or valuable homes, which were quietly absorbed into the society's control after their deaths. The ritual selections conveniently aligned with opportunities for profit and influence. Mrs. Thornton's later testimony shed light on the social coercion that maintained the group's power. Dissenters were ostracized. Questioning the disappearances meant losing your business, your social standing, even your safety. Fear and conformity kept the truth buried deeper than the bodies beneath St. Mary's. Reverend Whitmore's prosecution proved the most difficult. Court-appointed psychiatrists declared him severely delusional, though they agreed he had remained fully capable of methodical planning. His madness, they concluded, was not an excuse. It was a mechanism that had driven the entire cult. As the trial unfolded, the full extent of the horror came into focus. Forensic investigators exploring the cave system beneath St. Mary's uncovered the remains of 17 families, 63 victims in total, murdered over 35 years. The dead ranged from infants to elderly grandparents. Whole bloodlines erased. Many of the victims had been drugged before their deaths, confirming testimony about the use of spiritual substances. Some of the children's remains bore signs of struggle and prolonged terror, evidence that they had been aware of what was coming. Forensic evidence revealed distinct eras of killing. Under Father Blackwood, ritualistic and archaic. Under Whitmore, efficient and clinical. Together, they formed a single unbroken chain of organized murder disguised as sacred duty. Further investigation uncovered connections beyond Ashworth. Similar disappearances have been reported in neighboring Yorkshire villages. The same patterns, the same methods, the same names whispered in old parish records. What began as one village's secret now appeared to be part of a regional network of ritualistic killings cloaked in faith and scholarship. The exposure of the conspiracy left Ashworth in psychological ruin. Many residents had lived for years knowing, or at least suspecting, what was happening, and had chosen silence. The guilt was unbearable. Some couldn't face public scrutiny and took their own lives. Others left the village forever. Those who stayed were haunted by questions of complicity. Had they, too, played a part by looking away? By believing the lies? For the younger generation, the damage was even worse. They had grown up trusting the very people who had orchestrated or concealed murder. Teachers, priests, neighbors, all revealed as part of monstrous deception. Ashworth never truly recovered. Case became a grim milestone in the study of collective psychology, moral collapse, and institutional failure. Scholars across Britain and beyond examined Ashworth as a terrifying example of how ordinary, law-abiding citizens could be drawn into a cycle of ritualized murder through manipulation, fear, and the slow erosion of moral boundaries. Academic journals in criminology and sociology began referring to it as the Ashworth phenomenon, a shorthand for the process by which belief, authority, and community pressure can transform good people into accomplices to evil. Psychologists studying survivor testimony identified patterns of learned helplessness, groupthink, and spiritual coercion that mirrored the psychological mechanisms seen in cults and totalitarian movements. What had begun as a local tragedy was soon recognized as a microcosm of much larger human tendencies: obedience, conformity, and the desperate need to belong. Government commissions reviewing the case introduced a range of reforms inspired by Ashworth's failures. The Church of England implemented stricter psychological screening for clergy, mandatory external audits for parish finances, and new procedures for reporting misconduct. Law enforcement agencies introduced inter-county coordination units to flag clusters of missing person cases that might indicate larger criminal activity. In academic and medical fields, the case prompted ethics reviews and professional oversight structures that continue to influence policy today. The final report of the Royal Commission on the Ashworth murders, published in 1969, described the events as a collective moral collapse unprecedented in modern English history. It concluded that no single institution bore full responsibility. Rather, the tragedy had been sustained by a perfect storm of misplaced trust, bureaucratic complacency, and human denial. By the mid-1970s, the physical remains of Ashworth had nearly vanished. The overgrown roads led to crumbling foundations and empty cottages. St. Mary's had been reduced to a grassy mound with no marker, at least officially. Yet, visitors who strayed into the valley at dusk often reported faint impressions in the landscape, outlines of walls, traces of paths, even the soft echo of distant bells. Local folklore began to fill the silence left behind. Farmers in the neighboring villages spoke of lights flickering in the fields where the church once stood. Hikers claimed to hear voices carried on the wind, fragments of prayer, or perhaps echoes of confession. Some said that, on certain nights, the ground seemed to hum faintly, as if something beneath it was still breathing. Officially, the government closed the area to public access in 1977 after several incidents of vandalism and attempted excavation. The site was fenced off, marked as private property, and quietly erased from most modern maps. But rumors persisted, of amateur historians who vanished while searching for the sealed chamber, of photographs that developed with strange shapes in the background, of travelers who heard whispers calling their names from the trees. For decades, journalists and researchers tried to track down surviving members of the community, but most refused to speak. A few gave brief interviews, describing lifelong nightmares and an unshakable sense that Ashworth was not entirely gone. One of them, an elderly woman named Edith Palmer, who had been a child in the village during the 1950s, gave her final interview in 1992. She said softly, "We all thought the evil was buried, but sometimes when the wind blows from the north, I still hear them singing down there, and I don't think they ever stopped." The Ashworth conspiracy proved that evil doesn't only thrive under totalitarian regimes or in times of war. It can also take root within peaceful, democratic societies when the right psychological and social conditions exist. The religious nature of this case sparked deep discussion among faith communities about the dangers of unchecked spiritual authority and the urgent need for accountability within religious institutions. Both main perpetrators were ordained clergymen who used their sacred positions to manipulate and murder their parishioners, a horrifying reminder how vulnerable traditional structures of faith can be when trust goes unquestioned. The case also revealed the disturbing power of psychological manipulation. The meticulous record of how ordinary, rational people were gradually turned into accomplices to murder gave experts new insight into processes of radicalization and control, insights that would later shape research into cults, terrorism, and other extremist movements. This story reminds us how easily entire communities can be deceived and corrupted by those who claim to act in the name of tradition or a higher cause. The Higgins family, like so many before them, trusted their neighbors, their church, and their leaders. They never imagined that beneath the calm surface of their quiet village lay a secret network of murder and deceit that had been thriving for decades. The most terrifying part of the Ashworth conspiracy wasn't the killings themselves, but the way an entire community was slowly conditioned to accept and even participate in acts that would normally be recognized as pure evil. The process was so gradual, so carefully planned, that many participants truly believed they were serving a noble purpose, even as they committed or enabled horrific crimes. The case stands as a warning, a reminder of the importance of questioning authority, staying connected to the wider world, and refusing to accept explanations that defy reason, no matter how trusted or respected their source may be. It shows how isolation, both physical and social, can create the perfect breeding ground for dangerous ideas to grow unchecked, hidden from the light of scrutiny. But perhaps most importantly, The Ashworth case reminds us that true horror doesn't always come from monsters who look the part. It often comes from ordinary people. People who lose themselves in darkness, blinded by fanaticism, greed, or misplaced loyalty. The tragedy of the Higgins family serves as a permanent warning against surrendering our critical thinking to those who claim special wisdom or divine authority. So, what do you think? Could something like this really happen in a small, close-knit village? Do you believe ordinary people could be slowly manipulated into such horrific acts? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this chilling tale and want more stories that explore the darkest corners of human nature, make sure to subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share this video with someone who loves true crime mysteries. Until next time, remember, the most terrifying monsters often wear the most respectable faces, and our greatest offense against them is the courage to ask hard questions and reject comforting lies.